Status refers to the power dynamic between two or more people. High status people tend to dominate lower status people who submit to their demands. The realities of survival and needing to work together and cooperate lead us to create complex social hierarchies where people are always submitting to the demands of others, and that's how we work together. And we have these unwritten rules and these unspoken cues that we never really talk about that are the basis of how we perceive and engage with that social hierarchy and that cooperation between each other. And that's what makes improv so powerful and so fun to watch, is because people like to see others cooperating. It doesn't really necessarily happen that often or that smoothly in real life, but in improv, we know that nothing works if we're not constantly supporting each other and making the other person look good. It's a kind of a completely different transactional economy in that way. But we can learn things from it because it really exposes a lot of different parts about the human experience as far as our interpersonal relationships go. And status is a big part of that. Now, people with ADHD tend to exhibit low status. And unfortunately, that can hold us back from getting a lot of what we want in certain situations. And low status it not only can hold us back, but it's also associated with low self-esteem. So obviously that's a problem because that makes us more susceptible to anxiety and emotional overreactions and panic attacks. So I want to just explore a way to understand status that will allow you to adapt your status in certain situations and interactions to your benefit. So, as I said a moment ago, my understanding of the concept of status comes from the world of improv, and it's mostly based in Keith Johnstone's book called Impro. Keith Johnstone is a foundational improviser, and a lot of the techniques and exercises that he came up with are still what improvisers use today. So I highly recommend his book. He says that essentially there's two kinds of status. There's the kind that we normally think of, which I'll call social status, and that comes from your looks, your wealth, power, which is often displayed through titles you might have, like doctor, sir, even Mr. Any kind of the king, the queen, any kind of titles that you use, the manager. Those kind of confer a status on you. These things are all how you appear. But the second type of status, and the one that we're much more concerned with today, really centers around your behavior. It's what you do. So this type of status is not something that you have. It's based on how you act. So we change and deploy our actions in different ways and in different situations, and that's going to change our status constantly. So your status isn't really always the same. It's going through slight or maybe even large fluctuations depending on how you're behaving and how you're presenting yourself. So looking down and dejected and sad might win you some kind words and even compliments from people who want to cheer you up. That's an example of low status. On the other hand, strong gestures and easy eye contact, good eye contact could win you a job interview. I make it sound clownish because, I'm not really used to this format. But another example is we might adopt a low status and act subservient when we're being stopped in traffic by the police because we want to avoid, a ticket. We might adopt a high status at work by demanding a raise instead of asking for one. Demanding would be high status because you deserve it, of course. Asking is lower status, asking for permission, right? Because you are going to submit to whatever the decision of the higher status person is. So typically people will gravitate toward one of the two poles of status, either high or low. And that is not a moral issue. There can be, both types of people can be good people, and it's not an issue of inherent self-worth or worth in general. You know, that both people are, everybody is both high status and low status, just some people tend to go one way more often. Most atypicals tend to be low status and have lower self-esteem, and get less of what they want because they demand what they want less, and oftentimes act in a way like maybe they don't deserve it. They'll just take whatever you'll give them, sort of thing. And I tend to be naturally gravitating towards low status, and that's, like I said, typical. It's common among atypicals, and that's why this is something that I think is so important to talk about. And that's why we need to become aware of these status interactions, and we can learn to modulate our status. So we can communicate our status with a variety of behaviors. That means we can play with the status. So think of status games as a strategic way of behaving in a given situation. And it sounds a little bit sociopathic, like we're planning all of our thoughts and behaviors and reactions ahead of time, but it's actually because our brains are really wired to think in terms of status. So it's unconscious, and it's really a way that humans communicate in order to get things done and work together on a very deep, fundamental human nature sort of level. So you're doing it without really overthinking it, and that's kind of the point here. But when you're aware of it, you'll have more control over it. So status could be indicated in how we move, how we speak. Okay, so how we move. Well, we'll get into some examples in a second. How we move, how we speak, how we carry ourselves, how we breathe, how we touch others, and how we touch ourselves. How we ask questions, how we look at others, and how we approach problems or perceive problems, how we address them. So I've got actually a few indicators of status here, so I'll just put those up on the screen if I can. Boom. So let's see if you guys see this. Okay, great. So here are some indicators, first up, of low status, and you can read through those, but I'll just kind of call out a few of the big ones. So I usually think of low status as someone who's just uncomfortable looking in their body, in their physicality, and that is a lot of times a kind of nervousness, a kind of wanting to shrink. It can be talking really fast or mumbling. It often, there's a physiological element to it, and then there's also a cognitive component, the thoughts that you're having, and they kind of play off each other. Nervousness and like the feeling of low self-esteem in an interaction, the feeling of like having little power and needing to submit, can cause us to be nervous in a lot of situations, not knowing how we want to act, awkward and fidgety, again, touching our face and hair, and trouble with eye contact, and just seeing a lot of problems. It's kind of a general feeling of incapability, of powerlessness, and those all kind of describe a low status person. So they exude, think about the kind of energy that person exudes, that they kind of give off, the feel of it, the color, and how you feel inside when you're feeling low status. And then on the other end of the spectrum, low status people is best summed up as a comedian is low status, somebody a clown, somebody a fool. The people who put themselves lower and are lower on the status spectrum tend to denigrate themselves in order to lift others up, and that's usually to get some kind of favor, some kind of something that's going to help benefit them in some way. Or maybe it's just social obligation and they feel like that's going to help them fit in with what society wants. So let's take a look at the high status characteristics. These transitions are going great. So a high status person is somebody like Don Draper. If you haven't seen Mad Men, it's somebody who is cool, graceful, confident. They're not moving around a lot. There's not a wasted action. They're not asking permission. They're speaking with a normal tone of voice, not fast and not doing a lot of uptalk. Calm breathing and easily touching others, not avoiding touch, but also able to set firm boundaries without a problem. Just says exactly what they want and expects to get it. They ask questions confidently and will even interrogate. They don't try to avoid conflict. And I think that's a big part of low status, is trying to avoid conflict by being subservient. Like I said, with the police officer example earlier, being subservient in order to just go on your way and not have a conflict. So those are some of the high status markers, and these markers indicate high status and low status, but the truth is, even when you're not seeing those really obvious examples, it's happening all the time in really subtle ways that are probably nearly invisible to you most of the time. And we certainly don't talk about them. We don't call them out. John Stone said that every inflection and movement implies a status, and that no action is due to chance or really motiveless, without a motive. So status is quite obvious between social roles where there's a title involved, like boss and employee. But as I said before, even friends play status games with each other. So you might just be talking to a friend and they might mention a book that they read, and that elevates their status because, oh, they read a book, and maybe it's a prestigious book, and then that inherently sort of elevates them above the person that they're talking to, their other friend. But then the friend might say, oh, we read that last week in book club, which would turn the tables and the status dynamic back the other way, because now they're saying, oh, I read a lot of big books like that. I read them on a regular basis and have intellectual conversations about them. So these status interactions go back and forth, and they're really subtle variations. And humans are, so between friends, those sorts of hierarchies can be much more flexible and even joked about, but they're still there, and we're still settling into our subtle hierarchies. Even if we're about equal, during a conversation we're going back and forth just ever so slightly. Humans are great at measuring and ascribing values to things. We assess value immediately, unconsciously, and continuously. In any group of people, the highest status person is going to be the one who provides the most value to the group. And different groups value different things. So it's useful to identify what is valued by a group where you want to raise your status, where you think that'll be beneficial to you. So it's important beforehand to think about your status in this context. Think about how you want to appear to other people. Ask yourself, how do I want to come across to this group? And imagine what that behavior is going to feel like when you interact with that with that group or that situation. I would say even practice that and try to hold on to that feeling of being a high status person in that situation, and you will naturally be better with eye contact and, you know, the other high status things that we talked about. It's important that you don't, well, it's important that you don't fake it and you don't just try to throw some high status cues in, like suddenly you're making eye contact, like, you know, really fiercely and just locking on to people. Humans can tell like that with no effort who is authentically high status and who is just acting like a weirdo. It's very easy to tell. So, yeah, as I said a second ago with the friends example with the book, when the first friend mentioned that he had read the book and his status went up, the other friend's status must go down. Status works on a seesaw principle. So, like I said, for one person to go up, another person has to be down. And this is why John Stone said in his book that we enjoy seeing pop stars lose their fortunes. We enjoy seeing kings lose their thrones. We enjoy seeing the beggar become the king. We like to see status reversals. Comedians are a great example. They make us feel good by lowering themselves with their jokes and their, you know, their foolish stories, and that elevates us and makes us feel good as the audience. So with all these examples, you know, comedians especially, it should be obvious that it's possible to change your status. You know, like I said, you can't fake it, but a simplistic formula might be like I just said with the seesaw. If you want to raise your status, then you should diminish others and exalt yourself. Okay? And then if you wanted to lower your status, you would diminish yourself and exalt others. But that's a little too simple. For instance, bragging will automatically lower your status. That might sound strange because I just said to raise your status, you should exalt yourself. But when you brag, you're openly attempting to raise your status, and a high status person would never do that. A high status person knows that they're on top. So that's an important rule to remember when you're trying to raise your status in a situation. Okay? Again, not trying. You are being high status. So the highest form of status is not caring about your status, about what other people think. That's the highest form of status. So that's a mentality that you can cultivate that isn't just going to be you throwing awkward behaviors into your next social gathering. So because humans are always thinking in terms of status, we can all spot fakes, like I said. So don't try to hack it. Okay, we've already covered that. So think of that rule. Think of that rule of not caring what others think as a form of expressing your status, your confidence. You're thinking about how you want to be perceived by other people. You want to be perceived confidently. Here's a way to do it. You don't care what others think because your status is unquestioned. Think of status as a form of play. It doesn't need to be scary. It should be fun. It shouldn't be taken too seriously. So try playing a different status in a particular situation. You know, it's easy. You can lower your status even if you're a low status person. And if you remember that it's a form of play and kind of social gamesmanship, then it can be really fun, and you can really have a weird time with playing with your status, either lowering or raising it. None of us is just one way all the time. Even if we gravitate towards one end of the status spectrum or the other. We have many sort of selves inside. We've got a lot to give, and we can all play different parts for fun. You know, we can all be one of our lesser known selves for a little while. So, you know, have fun with it. And when we can play between low and high status without worrying too much about the stakes and the consequences, then we're automatically not caring about our status. We're automatically higher status. The second big key, besides just not caring, and this is kind of similar actually, is low reactivity. Low reactivity is the key to high status or low status. This is the one to remember above all else. Overreactions make us unbalanced. It sets us off our balance when we have an overreaction, and that presents an opportunity for the people who maintain their composure. They automatically become high status because we're off balance. Overreactions are foolish. So this is a good example of this is sunglasses. I know that sounds strange, but sunglasses almost automatically make people look cooler. And that's really because it's hiding their eyes, you know, so they're not even telegraphing their reactions with the movement of their eyes or their eyebrows. You can't tell you have a lot less information about how they're reacting to things if you can't see someone's eyes. So of course that's kind of a cheat because their eyes are totally hidden, but you know the principle applies. So being unaffected and effortless is high status. Low reactivity is high status. Being able to modulate your status with these two rules at the very least. You can look at all the examples of behavior that I've given you, and I'll give some articles at the end which give you even more examples of this, and check out Keith Johnstone's book. But those two rules, low reactivity and just playing and not caring, you know, playing with your status and being aware of it is going to give you a lot more control over your status. So maybe, you know, the hope is you'll be able to use that to cultivate more high status behavior when you need to deploy that in a strategic way. Like, for example, again, when you are asking for a raise at your job or demanding, you demand that raise, you high status individual. So, and that's hopefully going to raise your self-esteem and give you just better life outcomes. So even without fancy possessions or titles, you can behave in a way that increases your chances of being listened to, taken seriously, and getting what you want. So I will leave the reference materials in the description, and please like, share, subscribe to the video. Check us out on ADHDgo.com. Yeah, hit us up on Twitter. Anything you can. If you like this video, I'm trying to make more of it, and you know,